The morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood as Mike Reynolds wheeled himself up the newly paved driveway of his home. A retired Marine veteran, Mike had spent years serving his country, only to return home with injuries that left him relying on a wheelchair for mobility. Despite his disability, Mike was a fighter, his spirit unbroken. He had just moved into the community, a well-maintained but strictly HOA-controlled neighborhood, hoping to find peace and stability. As he admired his new home, a voice cut through the quiet morning air. "Oh, we have a new neighbor." Mike turned to see a middle-aged woman with a severe haircut, a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her smug expression and critical gaze darted across his property like she was scanning for violations. "I'm Karen Thornton, head of the HOA," she said with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We like to keep things orderly around here." Mike extended a hand in greeting, but Karen barely looked at it. Instead, her eyes locked onto his wheelchair, then darted toward his porch. "I hope you're aware of our community aesthetic policies. We have very strict guidelines, no unsightly modifications to properties." Mike raised an eyebrow. "I'm just getting settled in, ma'am." "What kind of modifications are you talking about?" Karen's smile tightened. "Oh, nothing yet." With a clipped nod, she spun on her heel and marched off, leaving Mike with an uneasy feeling in his gut. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something told him this HOA Karen was going to be a whole different battle. A few days later, Mike was in his garage, assembling the parts for a wheelchair ramp. The front steps of his house were an obstacle, and while he could manage with effort, a ramp would give him the independence he needed. As he positioned the first piece of wood, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Absolutely not." Mike looked up to see Karen storming down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, face twisted in outrage. "You can't build that ramp," she barked. "It violates HOA policies." Mike leaned on his workbench, keeping his cool. "I needed to get in and out of my home, ma'am." Karen scoffed, flipping through her clipboard. "Well, our bylaws prohibit any modifications that don't conform to the neighborhood's aesthetic. That includes ramps. You should have checked before trying to change things." Mike exhaled slowly, his military training kicking in. "I don't think the law agrees with you." Karen's smirk widened. "Oh, I think you'll find our HOA rules are very clear." Mike clenched his jaw. He could already tell this woman was on a power trip. The next morning, Mike found an envelope taped to his front door. It had the bold red letters, HOA violation notice. Opening it, he read, "You are in direct violation of HOA regulations by constructing an unauthorized structure, wheelchair ramp. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in a fine of $500 per day until removal. Further noncompliance may lead to legal action." Mike gritted his teeth. He had faced enemy fire in combat, but somehow this HOA nonsense was already testing his patience. He wheeled himself back inside, grabbing his phone. It was time to fight back. Mike wasn't about to back down. If there was one thing the military taught him, it was how to fight battles smartly. He spent hours researching federal laws on disability rights. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, was clear. Denying a wheelchair ramp was a direct violation of federal law. To be sure, he called a lawyer specializing in disability rights. The attorney confirmed his suspicion. HOAs don't have the power to override federal law. If they try to fine you or remove the ramp, they're in for a legal nightmare. Mike smirked. Now he had ammunition. But he wasn't done yet. He needed to make one more call. The next morning, Mike rolled up to the HOA office, legal papers in hand. He wasn't about to let Karen push him around. Karen sat behind a desk, her arms crossed, a smug grin on her face. "Back so soon, Mike?" "Here to pay the fine," she sneered. Mike dropped the legal papers in front of her. "Actually, Karen, I'm here to educate you on federal law. You're violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't deny me a wheelchair ramp, and you sure as hell can't fine me for it." Karen's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "This is HOA policy, not federal law. If you don't comply, we'll escalate this further." Mike leaned in. "Good, because I've already spoken to my lawyer. And if you try anything, we'll see you in court." Karen's face turned red. She hadn't expected him to fight back. But Mike wasn't done yet. He had an ace up his sleeve. Karen thought she could bully Mike into submission, but she had no idea who she was messing with. Mike reached out to a local news station that specialized in exposing injustice. When he explained how the HOA was discriminating against a disabled veteran, they were immediately interested. The next morning, a news van pulled up in front of the HOA office. A reporter and cameraman stepped out, ready to cover the story. Karen, caught completely off guard, stormed out of the office. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped, glaring at the reporter. The journalist turned to her with a microphone. "Miss Karen, we've received reports that your HOA is fining a disabled veteran for installing a wheelchair ramp. Would you like to comment?" Karen froze, realizing the cameras were rolling. "That's not true. We have policies in place to keep the neighborhood looking nice." Mike rolled up right beside her and faced the camera. "What she means is, they'd rather make life harder for people with disabilities than follow the law. But that's why we're taking this to court." Karen's face turned pale. She hadn't expected this kind of public backlash. The news report spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media was flooded with comments slamming the HOA for discriminating against a disabled veteran. Karen, realizing she was in deep trouble, tried to backtrack. "This is just a misunderstanding," she stammered in an HOA statement. "We fully support our veterans, and we are working to resolve this matter fairly." But it was too late. The damage was done. Mike's lawyer had already gathered evidence: emails, HOA guidelines, and even recordings of Karen's rude comments. With public pressure mounting, HOA board members started distancing themselves from Karen. "We had no idea she was handling things this way," one member told reporters. Even some neighbors who once supported Karen now changed their tune. "I thought the HOA was just enforcing the rules. I didn't know they were actually discriminating," one resident admitted. But Karen wasn't done yet. She was about to make things even worse for herself. Karen, now desperate to save face, made a last-ditch effort. She tried to change the HOA rules overnight. She called for an emergency HOA meeting and proposed a new rule. All exterior modifications, including ramps, require a special permit approved by the HOA president. And of course, Karen was the HOA president. She smirked as she presented the rule, convinced it would allow her to maintain control and keep Mike from building his ramp. But what she didn't expect was that Mike's lawyer wife, Jessica, had anticipated this move. Jessica calmly stood up in the meeting and said, "This new rule directly violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. Any attempt to enforce it is illegal." The room fell silent. Some HOA members nervously glanced at each other. They knew she was right, and they didn't want to be dragged into a lawsuit. But Karen wasn't backing down. "You think you can intimidate me with your fancy law degree?" she sneered. "This is my neighborhood, and I make the rules." Jessica smiled. "Actually, federal law makes the rules. And you just broke them." Then she pulled out a stack of legal documents and placed them on the table. "This is an official lawsuit. You're not just going to lose this fight, you're going to pay for it." Karen's face turned pale. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nobody wanted to be on the losing side. And then someone in the crowd stood up and spoke. "I think it's time for a vote on removing Karen from the HOA." A murmur spread through the room as more residents began nodding in agreement. Karen had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years, but now that her actions were exposed, even her staunchest supporters were turning against her. "I second that vote," a neighbor named Linda spoke up. "Karen has been running this HOA like a dictatorship. It's time for a change." Karen's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this to me. I am the HOA." Mike wheeled himself forward, his voice steady but firm. "No, Karen. You're just a bully who finally got caught." A hush fell over the room as the HOA board held an immediate vote. One by one, hands went up. "Majority rules," an older board member announced. "Karen, you're officially removed as HOA president, effective immediately." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned to her few remaining allies, but even they refused to meet her gaze. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You'll regret it." But no one was listening. Karen had finally lost. 2 weeks later, Karen found herself in a place she never imagined, sitting at the defendant's table in a courtroom, facing off against Mike and his legal team. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, local veterans, and even some of Karen's former HOA allies sat in the audience, waiting to see how the case would unfold. Mike sat beside his attorney, his expression calm but determined. Jessica, his wife and legal powerhouse, stood ready to take Karen down. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, glanced over the case files. I've reviewed the evidence, and I must say, I'm already concerned about what I see. Karen, now without the power of the HOA behind her, squirmed in her seat. Jessica stood and presented the case. She detailed how Karen had knowingly violated the Americans with Disabilities Act, illegally fined Mike, and attempted to use her HOA position to enforce discriminatory rules. Then she dropped the bombshell emails Karen had sent to other HOA members, mocking Mike and calling his ramp an ugly eyesore. The courtroom gasped. Even Karen's own lawyer looked horrified. Karen jumped to her feet. "Those emails were taken out of context," she shrieked. "I was just trying to protect property values." The judge slammed her gavel. "Enough. The law is crystal clear. The ADA protects individuals like Mr. Reynolds from discrimination, and your actions were unlawful." Karen's face went ghostly pale. The judge continued. "This court rules in favor of Mr. Reynolds. The HOA must immediately lift all restrictions on wheelchair ramps, rescind all fines, and pay damages to the plaintiff." Karen gripped the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. But the judge wasn't done. "Furthermore, Ms. Thornton, your actions were so egregious that I'm personally issuing you a fine for violating federal disability rights. You will also be required to issue a public apology." Karen gasped. What?" Mike finally turned to face her, a victorious smile on his face. "That's right, Karen. Looks like your rules don't apply here." Karen had spent years lording over the HOA, controlling every little detail of the neighborhood. But now she was the one being forced to comply. The judge's ruling wasn't just a legal victory. It was public. The news stations that had covered Mike's battle with the HOA ran follow-ups, broadcasting Karen's downfall to the entire community. Social media exploded with memes about HOA Karen, mocking her desperate attempt to control everything, even a disabled veteran's right to accessibility. The final humiliation came when Karen was ordered to make a public apology. A week later, the entire neighborhood gathered in the community center. The HOA board, now under new leadership, had sent out a mandatory notice for all residents to attend. Karen stood on the small stage, her face red with rage and embarrassment as she clenched the paper in her hands. She cleared her throat, glaring at the crowd. "I apologize," she muttered through gritted teeth. The crowd stared. Jessica crossed her arms. "Louder, Karen." Karen inhaled sharply, her voice shaking with forced humility. "I apologize for my actions against Mr. Reynolds. I now understand that my enforcement of HOA rules was discriminatory and unlawful." She swallowed hard, clearly struggling to say the words. I was wrong." Mike, sitting in the front row, simply nodded. He didn't need to gloat. Karen's public disgrace spoke for itself. Karen's forced apology was just the beginning. The HOA, desperate to distance itself from disastrous leadership, called for an emergency vote to overhaul its policies. "We need to ensure this never happens again," the new HOA president, Linda, announced at the next meeting. The first order of business? Striking down the ridiculous no wheelchair ramps rule. The motion passed unanimously. Then came the real reckoning. "We also propose an audit of all past fines and complaints under Karen's leadership," one board member suggested. "If anyone else was unfairly targeted, we should make it right." Mike smirked. He wasn't the only one who had suffered under Karen's reign. Dozens of neighbors started speaking up. "She fined me $200 for having a flower pot that was too colorful. She threatened to tow my car because it was parked at too sharp of an angle. She made me repaint my entire house because she didn't like the shade of blue I chose." One by one, the stories poured out. Karen had terrorized the neighborhood for years, but now her victims had a voice. The HOA board, realizing how deep the damage went, voted to refund all unjust fines issued under Karen's rule. Karen, sitting in the back, looked like she was about to explode. Karen sat stiffly in the back of the room, her face twisted with barely contained fury. She had spent years ruling the HOA with an iron fist, and now she was being dismantled piece by piece. But she wasn't done yet. "This is ridiculous," she suddenly snapped, standing up. "You're all turning against me over one little ramp?" The room fell silent. Mike leaned forward in his wheelchair. "No, Karen. We're turning against you because you've spent years making everyone's lives miserable. The ramp was just the last straw. Karen's hands trembled as she scanned the room, searching for her old allies. But they all avoided her gaze. Even her most loyal followers had abandoned ship. "Fine," she spat. "If you people want to destroy the neighborhood, be my guest. You'll regret this when the property values drop and this place turns into a dump." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. No one stopped her. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, but now the tables had turned. After storming out of the HOA meeting, she expected at least some of her former supporters to rally behind her. Instead, she found herself completely isolated. Neighbors who once feared her now openly ignored her. People whispered when she passed by. Her phone, once a direct line of power, was eerily silent. Then came the ultimate blow, a notice from the HOA. Karen ripped open the envelope, her eyes scanning the paper in disbelief. Notice of removal. Due to your gross misconduct, illegal activities, and misuse of power, you have been permanently removed from the HOA. Furthermore, you are personally responsible for any legal fees incurred due to your actions. Karen's jaw dropped. Legal fees? That meant thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. She tried to fight back, filing an appeal, but the board didn't budge. Without her position of power, she had nothing. Her downfall was complete. With Karen officially out of power, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. People who had once tiptoed around HOA rules were now smiling, chatting with neighbors, and even making small changes to their homes without fear of a nasty fine. Most importantly, Mike's wheelchair ramp remained exactly where it was permanently. The new HOA leadership even revised the bylaws to ensure accessibility for all future residents. Some neighbors, inspired by Mike's stand, installed their own ramps or railings in solidarity. Mike had one, not just for himself, but for the entire community. And Karen, she lasted 2 months after her downfall. The final straw came when a for sale sign appeared in her yard. Word spread fast. She was leaving for good. On moving day, neighbors gathered outside, watching as Karen angrily loaded boxes into a moving truck. As she slammed the truck's door shut, she locked eyes with Mike, who sat calmly in his wheelchair at the edge of his driveway. She huffed. "I hope you're happy." Mike smirked. "I am actually." Karen scoffed, climbed into her car, and sped off, never to terrorize another neighborhood again. As the truck disappeared down the road, Linda, the new HOA president, turned to Mike. "Well, I think this calls for a celebration." The neighborhood agreed. That night, they gathered for a barbecue in Mike's honor, a true community event, something Karen would have never allowed. As the sun set and laughter filled the air, Mike took a deep breath, finally at peace. Justice had been served.